Today's webinar about dissidents and human rights in Eastern Europe in the late Cold War. My name is Aryo Makko. I'm a professor of history at Stockholm University, where I also had the newly founded Hans Blix Center for the History of International Relations. I specialize in the history of the Cold War myself, and today's webinar, as you will know, is part of a larger project entitled From Helsinki to Berlin, Europe and the End of the Cold War. And I'd like to start by thanking the head of the project, Professor Luis Rodriguez from the University Institute of Lisbon, as well as Felix Suarez and Silvia Berendt of Young Educators, for entrusting me with the role of a moderator tonight. I received my doctorate actually for a dissertation about Sweden's contribution to the 1975 Helsinki Final Act and have been working on related aspects of the Cold War. And so I too very much look forward to today's presentations and discussion very much. I think it has a significance for both current events, current debates in Europe and the United States also. But the role of dissidents, human rights and soft power in the end of the Cold War is also a very hot topic debated by Cold War historians, historians of the 1980s more generally. So I think it'll be very interesting to listen to our three esteemed speakers, and I'll present each of them now, shortly before I then open the floor for the first speaker. So I'd like to present Norman Naimark, Douglas Selvage, and Henrik Bispinck. Norman Naimark is the McDonald Professor of Eastern European Studies at Stanford. After graduating from Stanford, he worked at Boston, Wellesley, and Harvard before joining the faculty of Stanford in 1988. He is considered one of the world's leading historians, I think one might say, of the Soviet Union and communism, and has also published widely about genocide and ethnic cleansing. He's the author and editor of many books, including The Russians in Germany, The History of the Soviet Zone of Occupation, which was published in 1995, Fires of Hatred, Ethnic Cleansing in 20th Century Europe, published in 2001, Stalin's Genocides, published in 2010, A World History of Genocide, published by Oxford, 2017, and most recently, the prize-winning Stalin and the Fate of Europe, the Post-War Struggle for Sovereignty, published by Harvard University Press in 2019. Then we will have Doug Selvage, who is a wissenschaftlicher Mitarbeiter at the Institut für Geschichtswissenschaften at Humboldt University in Berlin. Doug currently works on a project entitled Active Measures and Propaganda, 1966 to 1989, the Stasi, the KGB, and the European allies. He served as project director in the Education and Research Division of the Office of the Federal Commissioner for the Stasi Records in Berlin between 2013 and 2018. Douglas has published widely about the CSCE, the follow-up process of the CSCE, Polish-German relations under communism, and the history of the Soviet bloc more generally. His most recent book was published in German and was entitled Staatssicherheit und KSZE-Prozess, MFS zwischen SED und KGB, which translates as State Security and the CSCE Process, the Stasi between SED and KGB. And the book was co-authored with Walter Süss. Doug is currently co-editing a joint volume with Georg Herbstritt entitled Big Brother, the KGB and the Ministry of State Security, 1958 to 1989. I would finally also like to welcome our third speaker, Dr. Henrik Bisping, who is a contemporary historian and lecturer at the Chair of Modern and Contemporary History at Humboldt University of Berlin. Henrik Bisping received his doctorate from the University of Leipzig with a study on high school teachers as an educated middle class professional group in the 20th century. He has been working in the Education and Research Department of the Federal Commissioner for the Record of the Stasi since 2010, so a colleague of Doug, obviously. And he has also published widely about Stasi reports to the leadership of the Socialist Unity Party of Germany. As I mentioned earlier, Professor Norman Naimark will start with a comparison of dissidents in the GDR and the Soviet Union. So I'd like to invite Norman here to take up the floor. Norman, the floor is all yours.
And start? All right, I will do that. Nice to be here. Nice to see everyone. And this is a subject that in some ways is dear to my heart. I may be the only one here, I don't know exactly, who spent time with dissidents both in the Soviet Union and in the GDR in the 70s. And so I remember a lot of this history, and I remember a lot of the people involved. So it was an interesting process getting ready for this brief talk. I want to break it down into three parts. One part is the first part is the kind of dealing with definitions of dissidents, because I think it's important to do that, know who we're talking about. The second part is, talking about similarities. I'm going to do this as historians sometimes do, similarities and differences. So I'll deal with the similarities first and the differences second. So it's basically a three-part talk, and I'll never get through all my notes here. So just, cut me off like this when the time comes, or I'll try to cut myself off. I'm sure we can get into things in discussion and questions. Okay, let's start. Defining dissidents is really a problematic exercise. It doesn't work very well, I have to say, in the end. You look in the dictionary and it says, people who are in opposition to the government. Well, that's hundreds of thousands of people in the GDR, millions in the Soviet Union. Maybe if you said they were in open opposition to the government, that would make somewhat more sense. People have dealt with the origins of the term, Latin desideri, which basically means difference or differing. But people don't really like that definition either, and especially the dissidents don't like the definition. Elena Bonner, Andrei Sakharov's wife, said, Sakharov is a physicist, not a dissident. Solzhenitsyn, when he came to the United States, said, I'm not a dissident and I'm not an immigrant, even though that's what people wanted to call them. And the problem is dissidents is a name that, we gave them. Some of them took it on themselves, but they didn't like that name at all. Vladimir Bukovsky, when he went to England, got in front of a bunch of people who were expecting a dissident. And Bukovsky said they didn't know the first thing about the life I led or what was bothering me. I mean, the same thing I saw in, some writing by Rainer Kunze, who says, I came to the West, and people said, well, why did you come to the West? What's wrong with you? And then he complained as well, that they didn't understand the first thing about his life. So it's a really very, very hard road to define what a dissident is. And the way I've sort of thought about it and dealt with it as I was going through this talk was just to say it's a very broad term. It's one we're going to use. It's one that doesn't have a whole lot of meaning. We don't want to invest a lot of meaning in the term. I mean, we sort of know what we're talking about, but we're not really sure. And the other thing that's important is not to, have some kind of hagiography, as it will, of dissidents. In other words, not to elevate them to a place where we want them to be. I mean, they don't do that themselves. They don't want to be in that place. Václav Havel also said, this word dissident doesn't mean anything. And besides, we're not different. It's those crazy people who are in power are different. It's the people who go along with power who are different. We're the normal people. We're the ones, whose ideas and whose sense of self is normal and honest and real. And the others are the ones who are different and weird and abnormal. So we have to kind of think about this term dissidence in that way. It's not a good term, and maybe we could come up with something more specific. I don't know. And God forbid we come up with something in social science terms. So I'm going to stick with dissidence. Okay, let's talk a little bit now about similarities, between dissidents in Soviet Union and in the German Democratic Republic. A lot of the similarities come from the similarities in the system, in the two systems. What are they? They're Marxist-Leninist systems run by a party, a single party that claims all power. Those parties are run by semi-dictators. You could just call them dictators, but they're semi-dictators. They can be removed and periodically are removed. And so the dissidents, in other words, are dealing with systems that are the same, and that makes a lot of their actions very similar, and a lot of their reactions very similar. Another part of the story, of course, is what Doug is working on, the KGB and Stasi, that is to say the secret services and what they're doing and how they're operating, and they operate very similarly. One can say that, East Germany was, the GDR was more thoroughly penetrated, by Stasi officers and infiltrators than was the Soviet Union with the KGB, but the KGB did a hell of a good job, of penetrating, in other words, dissident circles, getting involved with repressing. Basically. So these secret services have really two functions. One of the functions is kind of to follow, to prosecute, sometimes to imprison, mostly to harass the dissidents. They harassed the dissidents. They caused trouble for them to try to keep them from doing what they were doing. Imprisonment was actually relatively rare in comparison to the number of people who were classified, as it were, as dissidents. And the second thing, of course, which we know prominently now from the archives, whether both the Stasi archives, also KGB, although we don't have access to KGB archives, but we have access to enough Central Committee material that we know exactly what was going on, which is that they were penetrating these circles, recruiting people from among the dissidents, even engaging in provocations with dissidents, reporting on dissidents and that kind of thing. And both services did this, and this made then the reaction of those people who were involved in the dissident movements quite similar. A final thing to say on this subject, on KGB, is and Stasi, is that they took enormous amount of time on the part of the regime. In other words, in both cases, in both the GDR and the Soviet Union, there's an astonishing amount of material available now from the highest levels of the Central Committee and the Politburo that shows that people were spending a huge amount of time on the dissidents, much more time than they were worth in some ways. And the bottom line in the new book by Peter Redaway, which I just looked at, they were doing a lousy job of it. In other words, they weren't able to control. They didn't know what to do. You read the Politburo stuff in the Soviet Union about Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov, tremendous amounts of material. They didn't know how to deal with these guys. And that then gave the dissidents, more power. It gave them more ability, to survive. Okay, I got to move quickly. The second thing, more quickly, the second thing that was similar, was the international environment. And, Doug and I think someone else is also going to talk about maybe about Helsinki, but, the international environment, the Cold War, and then détente and how détente worked, as well as Ostpolitik kind of figured into that, and the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 worked on the dissident movements in similar kinds of ways. There were different reactions, clearly, but this was the same international environment in which dissidents were operating, and that international environment included, by the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 1970s, what we might call human rights and human rights talk, which then sort of infiltrated, as you might say, the dissident movements, and had a very interesting and positive effect on their development. In other words, what's coming from the outside, whether it's in the Soviet Union or in the German Democratic Republic, in terms of human rights, plays a very powerful role. And that brings us then to Helsinki, but I'll leave that, until later. Okay, let me go quickly then to the differences, because they're more notable and they're more distinct. Now, I want to alert you a little bit to the work of Benjamin Nathans. I mean, he's got a book coming, it's not out yet, on dissidents with the Soviet Union, but he makes a very powerful argument, that dissidents and the culture of dissidents is specific to the countries in which they emerge. And I very much agree with that argument. In other words, that these are indigenous movements. And not, they borrow from each other, they look at each other, the international system affects it, but they're not, as Nathan says, avatars of our ideas of liberal, democratic ways of doing things. In other words, we tend to project our own ideas on the dissidents, and he says we can't do that. I mean, it's much like what Havel is saying too. Leave us alone, we know what we're doing. And we have to be very careful not again to project our own ideas. They come out of the domestic situations in both countries. Okay, so let's look quickly at those domestic situations. In the case of the Soviet Union, there are really two powerful facts that bring about the dissident movement. One is the tradition of the Russian intelligentsia. I'm not going to go into that. If somebody wants to talk about that, we can. But this is beginning already in the late 19th century, where the Russian intelligentsia are truth tellers. I mean, there are people who want to say, okay, this place really is awful, the czarist autocracy, and we're going to speak that way. We're going to say it, out loud, and in some cases try to do something about it. This goes to the Soviet intelligentsia as well, and this is a very narrow sense of what the intelligentsia is. Mostly writers, poets in the 1930s, who lost their lives, most of them, to the Stalin era, but they too were truth tellers. People who believed that you had to say what's real and what's going on. By the way, I'm going to transpose a little bit right now and say, I was just reading before I got on some new stuff about Alexei Navalny. I mean, Navalny is a classic Russian intelligent, truth teller. And, he believes that if he says what's right, it's going to influence a lot of people and it's going to bring down the Putin government. Well, whether it does or not, and whether he's right or not is a different kind of question. It very much comes out of that same tradition. The second piece of the Russians is specific again, to the Soviet situation, was the talk that began at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, again, overlapping with human rights issues about law in the Soviet Union. And again, this is Nathan's point that a lot of the dissident movement in the Soviet Union comes out of discussions about Soviet legality, and to use the law against the government. And you use that law in such a way that you push forward your cause. And a lot of the conflicts then between government and dissidents took place in the courts. And again, if you see that wonderful picture of Navalny with this, V signal inside that little glass box, it's perfect, for Soviet dissidents. who protested, at trials, who used trials as a way to get in. Okay, let me turn quickly again to the GDR. This is a very different tradition. It comes out of different kinds of ways of thinking about the world. First of all, it comes a lot out of Marxist-Leninists. I mean, people who were in the party, in the SED, and even if they weren't in the party, like Biermann, for example, were communists. I mean, the party wouldn't accept Biermann. I'm sorry, I'm going to keep my German straight there. They wouldn't even accept him. I mean, but he was a communist. He was a leftist. The criticism is to make Marxism-Leninism somehow better. To use the traditions of Marxism from the 1840s and so on, this kind of humanistic tradition in some cases, to reform the party, to make the party more responsive to people, to make it less bureaucratic, to make it less repressive, to make it more human, 1968-ish in terms of the Prague Spring. So the East German dissident movement then comes out of a leftist impulse, not out of one that rejects. I mean, the Soviets would have nothing to do with that. Many of them. I mean, again, we don't want to draw black and white comparisons, but on the whole, Soviet dissidents had nothing to do with that. Okay, then there are a whole series of other things. I guess what I don't want to do is go over my time. So let me just mention a couple of them, and then I'm going to finish up with something. So one, of course, is the existence of West Germany, which makes this very, very different than the Soviet Union. And the ability of the East German dissidents to interact with West German society, with West German culture, also with West German media, is extremely important. They didn't need samizdat, in the East German case. I mean, they could just get things published in the West pretty easily and get them smuggled in. I mean, I did a lot of it myself back into the East from the West. So that everything became known. They didn't need a chronicle of current events, which Soviet dissidents, spent months, hours, I mean, incredible efforts, in samizdat, typing up all this stuff, spreading it around and all that kind of thing. So in that sense, it was a very different kind of situation. Also, the whole business of how Ostpolitik worked and the interaction between East Germany and West Germany and the kind of expulsion of East German dissidents to the West, became, part of the story in West Germany. It was really very different from the Soviet Union. There were expulsions, of course, but it was a whole different kind of sense of how that went on. There's this issue also that, millions of East Germans left their country, sometimes legally, sometimes illegally, starting in 1949 to 61, of course, that was 2.5 million. After 61, there are thousands who leave, again, usually illegally. There was the Menschenhandel, which most people know about, end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, where 11,000 or so, maybe more, East Germans who had been locked up for political purposes were then bought out, as you probably know, by the West German government and went west. 1984, there were large thousands of people who were sent out, partly, to make the West Germans happy so that they would give more credits, partly just to get rid of them. In other words, there was this kind of pressure valve in East Germany, which let people out. There was no pressure valve in the Soviet Union. The Soviets really resisted sending out dissidents, didn't want to do it. They did it only in the end because they had to. Okay, in the Soviet Union, I'm going to now try to conclude because it's too much. But I'm going to mention a couple of things, and maybe that will bring questions that I can talk more about. One is that Soviet Union also had 186 different nationalities, each group of which, had their own dissident movement. So the whole nationality business in the Soviet Union was a powerful impetus for the dissident movement. There was stuff going on with the Sorbs in East Germany, of course, but this is nothing like, what the Ukrainians meant or what the Crimean Tatars meant, or others in the Soviet Union, not to mention the Jews. We haven't had a chance to talk about the Jews, but that was a whole separate part of the dissident movement. And by the way, it was part of the dissident movement. It wasn't separate from it. Anatoly, later Natan Sharansky, made his fame, not just by being a refusnik, meaning the government refused to let him go and put him in jail, but by helping other dissidents, by drawing the Jewish movement in with the other dissident movement. And the final two words, or more than two words, but the final area needs to be talked about is the church. And this is really important. I'm sure you've had people talk about it. But, the differences are enormous between the Soviet case and the East German case. In the Soviet case, you have Russian Orthodox Church. The Russian Orthodox Church, since Peter the Great, has been part of the state, right? And this didn't change. And it still hasn't changed. I mean, it's part of the state. And it's a subordinate part of the state. So the Russian Orthodox Church, I see Bob Geckel is in this room somewhere, has written extensively on this, on these issue of the churches in the two places. The Russian Orthodox Church had a few dissidents, but on the whole, it was thoroughly penetrated by the KGB. It would never, be the kind of place where dissidents could find succor or help. The contrast, of course, is the Lutheran Church or the Evangelical Church in East Germany, which gradually, for a lot of different reasons that we can talk about if you want, gradually became a powerful element in providing a kind of cover, a home for East German dissidents. It helped bring about and nurture the peace movement, the environmental movement. A lot of activists, who were upset by the militarization of East German society, especially in the 1970s, in a period of human rights talk, in a period of kind of peace, and therefore, served an extremely important function in bringing together people from various areas, together as, in quotes, dissidents. Now, in the Soviet Union, the only place where people came together were in the psychiatric hospitals, where they were placed because they were thought they were crazy. I mean, their dissident meant crazy, right? And if they were a dissident, Soviets even liked the word dissident because that meant they were nuts. They were against the system, they were against the society. So they put them in these psychiatric facilities. And the other place was the Gulag, where there were labor camps, right? And they were supposed to learn how to be good socialist laborers in these labor camps. And I always thought that was a bit of nonsense, but that was the formal idea of the labor camps. Well, in East Germany, you didn't have any of those things. They came together in the church, and the church provided cover. So, two quick conclusions. One, the Soviet dissident tradition goes on with Navalny. By the way, Gorbachev, adopted many ideas from the dissidents. One powerful one was Glasnost, which really came out of the dissidents who said, we've got to be honest. There was a lot of talk about Glasnost. Case of the East Germans, of course, the church, proved to be a tremendously powerful influence in the fall of 1989, and the demonstrations that went on and how the demonstrators behaved, in Leipzig and Dresden and other places in the former German Democratic Republic helped bring down the wall and communism in that country. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Norman, for a very, very interesting and engaging talk. We have 10 minutes, I think, for questions. So I'd like to invite the audience to present their questions, either by just opening their mic and asking, or writing it in the chat, and I could read it if there is some issue with a microphone or so. But
hey. Yeah, I would just like to ask about the different kinds of, for example, dissidents, let's say in the case of the Soviet Union, right? Because you had so many different countries in the Iron Curtain. Like, can you, I don't know, maybe elaborate on like any meaningful differences between this kind of different dissidents from different countries, if there was any kind of subcurrent, let's call it, of dissidents?
Well, if I thank you for the question. I mean, if I understand correctly, what you're saying is, what are the differences between the various parts of the Soviet Union and how those dissidents operated, right? And or just how to think about the great variety. So one of the parts of the variety, again, has to do with religious peoples. So, I mean, just occurred to me, I mean, I did a little bit, George Schultz has just died here at Stanford. He was 100 years old. And he played a very powerful role in getting Pentecostals, out of the Soviet Union. And this was one of the things in the 1980s that brought about, in the 1970s, that brought about kind of detente, and also that fostered. I'm sorry, it's the 80s. What am I talking about? That fostered the arms talks, the arms reduction talks between the Soviet Union and the United States. Anyway, Pentecostals were a group in Siberia mostly of people who wanted out of the Soviet Union and wanted to practice their religion in their own way. And made contacts with the Americans and the American embassy as a way to do it, and then were led into the American embassy, and there they were stuck because the Soviets weren't going to let them out. So the Pentecostals, and they're just one group, they're Seventh-day Adventists, again, remember the Jews, all of these various religious groups had their own agendas. I mean, they opposed the Soviet Union as it stood. They would have preferred a democratic Soviet Union in which they could have practiced their religions and their cultures the way they wanted. But, and each was different in their own way, although they did strive to join together. All right, let's take something like Ukrainians. I mean, Ukrainians started to organize themselves already, right, in the late 60s and early 70s. On several different bases. One is on the Uniate Church. So the Uniate Church was basically stomped on by the Soviet Union. It was banned. So it was semi-underground. Ukrainian national identity, especially in Western Ukraine, is tied closely to the Uniate Church. So what Ukrainians are saying to themselves, not so much as that we want independence, but we want the ability to be Ukrainians. I mean, if you know the history of the Soviet Union, there was a period in the 20s when the Soviets actually encouraged the development of separate national consciousnesses among the various peoples of the Soviet Union. So Ukrainians could use their language in schools. They could, they could have the Uniate Church. They could have their own literature and their own historical writing. But then in the 30s, this all got clobbered. And Khrushchev, although not as violent, obviously, as Stalin, was not a man who believed in the distinctiveness of the Soviet peoples. And subsequently, Ukrainians were very frustrated. And so they formed their own underground movement. Some of it was above ground, some of it was below ground, some of it was tied into the general dissident movement around the country. And you can repeat that same thing. I'm not going to go to, talk about Latvians and Lithuanians and Tatars. Tatars. Last example, Crimean Tatars, had been deported to Kazakhstan and Central Asia. They had never been forgiven for allegedly, I say allegedly because there's a lot of question about what the truth is here, collaborating with the Nazis during the war. So their land was taken away from them. But they started to filter back during the Khrushchev period to the Crimean Peninsula, organized themselves, and started to demand, their rights as Crimean Tatars. Well, they got clobbered again, but then they got tied in with the Moscow movements, and there was an attempt of all of them to try to work together, but these are very distinct. So they're looking for their land. They're looking to be able to say, okay, the Crimean Peninsula is, that belongs to Tatars, not the Russians. And so, yes, so that contributed to the turmoil. In other words, it eventually helps, we don't want to say that brought down the Soviet Union, but helps bring down the Soviet Union. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question before we move on to our second presentation. Maybe we also can use the reactions and raise a hand function in the bottom of the menu. I don't see anyone, but then maybe, Norman, I would like to ask if you just could give a brief analysis of why communist regimes did not clamp down on dissidents in the same fashion as they did in the 1950s. What had changed by the time, as a context also for?
Okay, I think they're really two-part answer. The first part is clearly the changes that I mentioned in the international system. In other words, the changes that have gone on have tied the Soviet Union and East Germany, to opinion in the West. In the case of the Soviet Union, it's clearly the United States, but also Europe as a whole, especially Western Europe, which is judging the behavior of the Soviets. So what do you do, with Sakharov, who is a well-known physicist, the creator of the Soviet atom bomb, who says, honestly, this society is organized all wrong and it's not serving the needs of the people, and stop lying. What do you do with it? Well, it's hard, it's hard to lock him up. They didn't dare try to poison him, which is what is going on today, right, in Russia. And they're afraid, in other words, of world opinion, because they need, they need grain, they need trade, they need credits, and they need arms control. And all of those things, in the period of détente, they feel serves their interests. So they can't really, right? And they do sometimes. They put people in the gulag, as I said. They put people in psychiatric hospitals all the way up until 1989, by the way. This is not something that ends. But, world opinion is tremendously powerful. And, that's part of the story. And part of the story is domestic self-image. In other words, it will cause them more trouble domestically. Again, with Navalny, I think they make a terrible mistake by locking him up now, for 2.5 years. That's a terrible mistake. He's going to be just the center of all of this attention and all of this, hubbub and demonstrations. Other people are going to be drawn into it. If I were sitting in the Kremlin, I would say, no, don't do this. It's a real terrible idea. And they, the Soviet leaders had the same thought, rather than lock these people up. I should say, by the way, too, that they have, when I'm saying they now, we're talking about the Brezhnev period mostly, have an image of themselves as the defenders of Soviet legality. And it is true that the Soviet Constitution, the laws, as I was explaining, in terms of official law, does take society, in quotes, into account. Actually, society is very important in terms of individual rights. But in theory, individual rights are served by the Constitution. And so to crush people's individual rights is also something that bothers them. And the Jews, is a case, and this, served the whole purpose of the dissident movement as a whole. The Jewish issue just became a tremendous focus of attention. Again, this didn't, this was very different in the GDR. But in the Soviet Union, this became a tremendous focus of attention for, by the United States. So we linked trade, to Jewish immigration, the right to immigrate. And once Jews had the right to immigrate, then, or were seen as having a right to immigrate, that then opened up a whole panoply of, problems for the Soviet Union. They couldn't arrest the Jews. I mean, they did arrest some Jews and put them away. But on the whole, I think they said to themselves, okay, let's just get rid of this, problem and try to get the most out of it as we can, including trade deals and, East-West trade and that sort of thing as a way to do this. Now, linked up again, let me just say one word about dissidents. Frequently when we're talking about dissidents, the refuseniks or the Jews, or even in East Germany, when we're talking about a lot of the people who were sent to the West or who went to jail, these are just ordinary people who want to get the hell out, right? In other words, these are not, in quotes, dissidents. They don't like the governments where they're living, but they're not ready to stand up and fight in any way, and don't stand up and fight. What they do is they just want to get out. I mean, in the case of the East Germans, some of these people went to jail on purpose to be bought out. I had some friends who did that. They went to jail on purpose. They served prison terms, 1.5 years or 2, just to get out, of East Germany at the time. And in the Soviet Union, with the Soviet Jews, you have a very similar thing. Mostly they weren't. Mostly, not, again, generalizing. They were not believing Jews necessarily. They didn't necessarily practice their religion. They didn't really care very much. But there was discrimination against Jews, and they thought, let's get the hell out while we have the chance.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Norman, for talk and answers. And hopefully we'll have more time to return for general discussion, but it's now time to give the floor to our second speaker, Douglas Selvage, and he has slightly modified his title to Soviet and East German Dissidents, Different Paths, 1975 to 1986. Please, Douglas, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, it's the typical thing for the historians then is to later limit the broader thesis to make it more specific so that it actually is more compelling. So I'm looking at Soviet and East German dissidents, different paths from 1975 to 1986. So in some ways I'll be repeating some of the points that Norman has already made, but I'll get into some more specifics, and hopefully not too many specifics, but enough to make my point. I make my standard disclaimer: any views I present today don't necessarily represent the views of any of my employers, past, present, or future. I have my own reasons for making that, but these are my own views. Okay, I want to just start though with 1975. I think that's sort of a turning point in terms of encouraging dissidents and opposition in East Central Europe and the Soviet Union to the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, or the so-called CSCE. They're also popularly known as the Helsinki Accords in 1975. The Helsinki Final Act was signed by 35 states of Europe and North America. And as part of this sort of agreement, it was sort of a compromise on what rules they would use in fighting the Cold War in Europe, in a sense. In effect, the Soviet Union and its allies achieved something that they wanted, which was basically recognition of the inviolability of borders, or de facto recognition of the existing borders. The Soviet Union, especially Brezhnev, liked to interpret this as meaning that the West recognized the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. And in return, the West was able to get out of the CSCE in part 3 of the agreement, the so-called basket 3, the idea that there was this commitment to increase human contacts between East and West, and also the spread of information between East and West. Also in the Helsinki Final Act, and the first part was the 7th principle, which basically confirmed the commitments of all the parties to human rights. Now, of course, since it was a compromise, all of these things were balanced out in the Accords, where the West said, okay, you agreed to human rights, and the Soviets said, yes, that's true, but we also agreed to Principle 6, non-intervention in internal affairs. So we get to define what human rights are in the Soviet Union or in the Soviet bloc. So this is always a matter of contention between East and West. So there's a debate over what does the Helsinki Final Act mean, since it is in the end a compromise. Now, what's important in this whole thing about the CSCE Final Act, and what was somewhat unexpected, is that we'll call them dissidents in the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc pick up on Principle 7 and Basket 3, and they argue now, and this is again in keeping with the sort of Soviet legality, the argument that the Soviet Union needs to recognize its constitution, its own legal agreements. They say, okay, well, now there's this international agreement, and the Soviet Union says it recognizes human rights, it recognizes human contacts as being important, and therefore we're going to hold the Soviet government to fulfill the Helsinki Final Act, meaning the human rights provisions and the human contacts provisions. And of course, one of the leading figures in pushing this interpretation already in 1975 is Andrei Sakharov, sort of the father of the Soviet hydrogen bomb. He, of course, had already become active in the human rights sphere already in the 1960s and 1970s, before they focused on the Soviet Constitution. Now they had this international agreement where they said, well, we can appeal to Western governments, other signatories to the Helsinki Final Act, to put pressure on the Soviet government to live up to the Helsinki Accords. So out of this, a reaction within the Soviet bloc, of course, the Soviets and the communist governments like to portray this, oh, this is the West organizing this, but it was actually organized internally by dissidents, is the formation of so-called Helsinki groups. First of all in the Soviet Union with the Moscow Helsinki group in 1976, which says they're going to monitor basically how the Soviet Union is fulfilling or not fulfilling the human rights provisions of the Helsinki Accords. They keep track of this, and then they basically appeal to non-governmental organizations in the West, the Western press, to Western public opinion, and Western governments to put pressure on the Soviet Union to fulfill the human rights provisions. Other Helsinki groups spring up across the Soviet Union, in Ukraine, in Georgia, and in Lithuania, for example. Similar groups arise in other communist states, although, of course, as Norman mentioned, they're also very different in terms of their national context. In Poland, there's the Committee to Defend Workers, or CORE, forms in 1976, and they make reference to the Helsinki Final Act in defending the rights of workers inside of Poland. And more importantly, I think in terms of Helsinki activism, is Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia, formed in January 1977, which, just like the Soviet Helsinki groups, say, well, our government in Prague, we're going to make sure, we're going to monitor their fulfillment of the human rights provisions of the Helsinki Final Act. And what they do is they not only appeal to Western governments and non-governmental organizations and the Western press, Western media to put pressure on their own governments, but they also make use, and this is another part of the Helsinki Final Act, is there are supposed to be follow-up conferences to monitor progress on the Helsinki Final Act, including in areas like confidence building measures between East and West to prevent a war, also in terms of trade and economic relations, scientific and technical relations. But of course, the Helsinki groups and certain NGOs in the West and certain Western governments, especially the United States and the Netherlands, make use of these follow-up conferences to pressure the Soviet Union and its allies to basically live up to their human rights commitments. Now, this brings us to an interesting question, and that is, why was there no Helsinki group in East Germany? You might have noticed I mentioned the Soviet Union, I mentioned Czechoslovakia, I mentioned Poland, but why not in East Germany? Well, in a sense, you could say that maybe there were sort of failed Helsinki groups. That's sort of how the Stasi looked at things. After Wolf Biermann, who was mentioned before, this East German opposition figure, was also a singer, visited the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany in 1976. The East German government basically took away his citizenship and told him he couldn't come back. And there are protests throughout East Germany about this, people signing protest letters, and many of these people are imprisoned. And this wave of imprisonment and repression following the expatriation of Wolf Biermann leads some individuals to organize an opposition to try to pressure the East German government to let these people out of prison. So first, there's a group in Naumburg, a group of Catholic and Protestant theology students and clerics who develop contacts to Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia and are to some extent inspired by them. And they put out this so-called Querfurt paper about peace and justice today, which is basically a version of Charter 77 based on Christian principles, calling for the respect of human rights and also for the ends to the repressions based on Wolf Biermann's expatriation. The same thing happens to some extent in Jena, where there's another circle again around the church there amongst the evangelical church, the youth parish, the Junge Gemeinde. Some individuals there organize also to protest against these repressions, and they develop contacts to Charter 77, as well as a West German NGO to try to pressure the East German government to basically let people out of prison and to end this wave of repression. In the end, though, their efforts are not that successful. The East German government pressures the evangelical church basically to curtail this activity, right? They say, well, we allow you to, practice your faith, but here you're letting these opposition figures do this. So they started to put pressure on the church. The Stasi does as well, of course. And also some of the individuals involved in these different circles end up in prison. But in general, it breaks up rather quickly. No later than 1980 would I say that there's any more sort of activism based directly on the Helsinki Final Act. There's not this effort to, in a sense, follow the path of Charter 77, at least in terms of appealing to the human rights provisions of the Helsinki Final Act. Now, why is this the case? And Norman already brought this up, the fact that most of the people involved in the East German opposition supported reform communism. If we look at Robert Havemann, who is sort of the leading figure in the East German opposition, a former member of the Communist Party, a former Stalinist who basically breaks with the party and begins to push for basically more democracy, more human rights inside of East Germany. He basically supports this idea of reform communism, as does Wolf Biermann, who, as I mentioned before, had been expelled and expatriated to the West. And for them, their only real reference to the CSCE is the provision for non-intervention in internal affairs. Now, the Soviets used this to say, or the communist governments used this to say, well, you can't complain about a human rights record because that's an internal matter. Well, the way that Havemann and Biermann interpret the CSCE Final Act is, well, if other states can't interfere in internal affairs, that means, for example, in the case of Czechoslovakia in 1968, the Soviets invaded to suppress reform communism. Well, thanks to the Helsinki Final Act, the Soviets have basically agreed, oh, we're not supposed to do that anymore. And so that means that there's room now for socialism with a human face, right? Which is sort of the motto of the Prague Spring in 1968. They are also inspired by communism in Western Europe, so-called Euro-communist parties in Italy, Spain, and France, which are also pressuring the East, also the Soviet Union and East Germany to guarantee more human rights. But this stands in quite a great contrast to, for example, to Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia or the Polish opposition, I mentioned CORE, because they had moved beyond socialism with a human face. They don't believe anymore that these communist governments can reform themselves. In fact, if the Communist Party tries to reform itself, as they did in Prague in 1968, this could lead to Soviet intervention. Therefore, they said the best that we can do is to organize around the principle of human rights to try to create more room in a civil society, to create sort of public spaces outside of the control of the Communist Party state, right? So this is basically broadening civil society and narrowing the dictatorship of the Communist Party. But the idea of changing or reforming communism is something they've sort of left behind. Another reason why there's no real Helsinki group besides reform communism is that the East German opposition became very much focused in the independent peace movement, especially beginning in 1980 or 1979, as a reaction to the increased militarization of East German society. Basically, all high school age boys are supposed to take part in compulsory military training. There's much opposition to this. This inspires opposition inside of East Germany, also in the room within the churches there, who promote pacifism or more peaceful policy. So you see opposition in the form of an independent peace movement. And this peace movement strengthens in 1980 after NATO basically says, well, approves the NATO dual track decision after the Soviet Union basically places all of these SS-20 missiles in East Central Europe, right? These intermediate range nuclear missiles. NATO responds and says, well, if there's not an agreement with the Soviet Union to remove those missiles by 1983, we're going to place our own intermediate range missiles in Europe. And so this spurs peace movement inside of West Germany, for example, the Green parties, and you see a parallel movement inside of East Germany. And you see increasing contacts between the peace movement in East and West Germany. So East German dissident Ulrike Poppe, who was very active in the independent peace movement, said, quote, "The members of the opposition in the GDR did not devote as much attention to the CSE process as in the other Eastern Bloc states," unquote. So this is also the case in comparison to the Soviet Union. Now, it's important to note, however, that they did use some of the tactics of Charter 77. They very much admired Charter 77. They also admired the Soviet dissidents, and they used many of their same tactics. For example, living as if they lived in a democracy, living as if human rights were respected. For example, organizing demonstrations that were otherwise illegal to protest against the East German government and to protest against armament of the Soviet bloc. Now this brings us to the question of, okay, what are the main differences or conflicts with Soviet dissidents? Well, I've already mentioned that in the East German opposition did not believe in organizing directly around human rights and CSE, at least not before 1986. This starts relatively late. I'll talk a little bit about this, but I think Henrik will be getting into more details as well. And secondly, I think this is also very important, is the East German opposition downplayed the right to immigrate as a human right and even opposed its use by East Germans, right? Well, why was this the case, right? Well, first of all, I think it's important to note that for the Soviet dissidents, this is one of the key points, one of the things that they were trying to push through against the Soviet government. And for example, Sakharov, the Moscow-Helsinki group, dissidents inside the Soviet Union, appealed to the Universal Declaration of Rights, of Human Rights of the United Nations. In Article 13, it said, everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. As part of this, of course, one could just leave one's country and stay abroad, right? So this is considered to be a fundamental human right. And this is something that Andrei Sakharov, for example, consistently emphasizes. In the CSCE Final Act and Principle 7, it reconfirms the commitment to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations. So you could say that, at least as a footnote, it's also in the CSCE Final Act. So you could say that the CSCE Final Act confirms once again this right to immigrate. Of course, this is something that people argue about. This is something that German scholars today choose to downplay or say it's not really there. But it is, arguably there in the CSE Final Act. Now, of course, in the case of the Soviet Union, they were applying, especially in the case of the Jewish refuseniks that Norman already mentioned. Of course, Nathan Sharansky, Anatoly Sharansky was very active in the Moscow-Helsinki group, pushing for this right to immigrate as a fundamental human right. Also, there were others inside the Soviet Union, including ethnic Germans, Armenians, and others, who also were pushing for this right to immigrate. Now, why is it that the East German opposition opposes or doesn't choose to promote this right to immigrate? Well, part of the problem is that, and this is interesting in the case of East Germany, is that in some ways Helsinki activism was hijacked by people who wanted to immigrate to West Germany. For example, the first major action appealing to making use of the CSCE Final Act and this idea of human rights is a petition in Riesa by people there who want to leave the GDR permanently in August of 1976, using much the same language as the Moscow-Helsinki group or of Charter 77 or of CORE in Poland. They say, look, the CSCE Final Act says, you know, our government needs to respect human rights. Our East German government has rejected our right to immigrate, and they need to respect the Helsinki Accords, and they need to respect the UN Human Rights Conventions. And we see this until the end of the GDR, basically individuals writing to the German government, East German government, saying, I want to immigrate, I have a right to immigrate based on CSCE and the UN Human Rights Convention. This is something that the East German government makes illegal. They say people who appeal and say, well, you need to let me immigrate based on the CSCE Final Act, that's illegal, and they should actually be punished for that, lose their job, be imprisoned, but people continue to do this. And of course, in the end, they're successful. Now, one reason that there's this breach as well is that the immigration movement inside of East Germany, people who are applying to leave, many of them connect up to conservative human rights organizations in West Germany that are more affiliated with conservatives in West Germany, such as the Christian Democratic parties. And of course, many of the East German opposition figures identify more with the Green Party or the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, or even Western Communist parties. So this is another reason why there's sort of this rift. It's partly, again, the existence of West Germany, in a sense, means that the East German opposition is split in a certain direction that's very different than in the Soviet Union. So why did the East German opposition oppose using the right to immigrate? Now, many of them would say, okay, there's a right to immigrate, but you shouldn't use it. Well, the most important reason was it weakened the potential for opposition at home. The East German government, in the end, due to economic reasons, due to its need for an effect to loans from West Germany, the need for relations with West Germany, they were more willing to let people immigrate. But this means that people who are upset and basically hated the dictatorship in East Germany, instead of staying there and fighting it, along with the dissidents inside of East Germany, they immigrate to West Germany. So this is a loss of opposition potential. Also, the Stasi made use of this desire to immigrate, basically in dealing with the East German opposition. So many East Germans who were involved in opposition activities, I mentioned already these people involved with the Querfurt paper, this Naumburg group, this group in Jena of people who opposed the repressions after Wolf Biermann. Many of them ended up in prison, and basically the Stasi or the East German government said, look, you can stay in prison or you can immigrate to West Germany. What do you want to do, right? And this is a tool that the Stasi uses quite often to lessen opposition inside of East Germany, is to push people to immigrate. Also, in a sense, it's impractical in the case of the East German regime. And this is also, by the way, why the West German government isn't pushing the East German government to recognize the right to immigrate. Because if the East German government were to say one day, okay, everybody has a right to immigrate, which is actually what happens in 1989, you have a right to leave, basically it would mean the collapse of the East German regime. And it was impractical to sort of ask the East German regime to do this because it would mean the end of the East German regime. Also, many East Germans opposed this sort of immigration to West Germany because many of them said, hey, look, you know, I want to visit my relatives in West Germany someday. And the fact that a lot of these people go to West Germany and never come back means that, you know, they don't let me visit my relatives, right? So there's a lot of opposition to this sort of immigration movement, but the immigration movement remains strong. And it continues to appeal to the CSCE Final Act. I don't know how much time, do I have any time left, or like? and go into the turning point, or I can skip the turning point.
Maybe 2 to 3 more minutes.
Okay, well, there's sort of a turning point in 1985 to 86 where the East German opposition moves a little bit more in the direction of human rights, a little bit more in the direction of Helsinki, more towards Charter 77, more, and by moving more towards Charter 77, in a sense, they're moving more towards sort of the model of Helsinki activists pioneered by the Soviet dissidents. In 1985, Charter 77 issues the so-called Prague Appeal. Charter 77 had already also gotten active in the peace movement, saying, okay, we also support peace. We're against sort of the nuclear armament of Czechoslovakia. We protested here. And part of this is we need to have the human right to be able to protest at home to stop sort of the stationing of missiles. So the Charter 77 is very clever. They're sort of a bridge to the West German Greens, right, by they saying we support disarmament. And they're also a bridge to the East German opposition. So in 1985, Charter 77 issues this Prague Appeal, basically arguing with their friends, the opposition in East Germany, saying, okay, look, we agree with you about the need for disarmament and peace, but you know, why don't you make more use of the Helsinki Final Act to push for human rights? And so there's this very open debate between sort of the independent peace movement in East Germany and Charter 77 over whether to use the Helsinki Final Act or not. And of course, the communist regimes are very upset about this very public debate because these are the sort of things that they hate. The idea that they're pushing to say, you know, look, your missiles aren't any better than the Western missiles, you should withdraw them. And secondly, they're talking about, well, you know, how do we press for human rights? And basically the East German opposition says, well, you know, you've been doing this for years, but it hasn't brought much of a reaction, but okay, we'll see what we can do to use the Helsinki Final Act to press for human rights a little bit more inside of East Germany. One of the responses is in late 1985 or early 1986, there's a formation of what some would call the first Helsinki group in East Germany, the Initiative for Peace and Human Rights, or Initiative Frieden und Menschenrechte, or IFM, which rises out of the independent peace movement. And they say they are also going to push for human rights inside of East Germany. They begin to print their own Samizdat journal, Grenzfälle, similar to East Germany and Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia. It's important to note, however, that this group consists of only 20 members, and it's very much it creates great divisions within the independent peace movement, because there are many people in the independent peace movement who are saying, look, you know, this is something that's going to provoke the regime even more than, you know, peace activism, and, you know, this isn't really our focus, right? So there's actually rifts within the opposition in East Germany, and this is a very small group, small but very vocal group, very charismatic group, but still it's about 20 people, at least at the beginning. And even this group, right, the IFM, is still opposed to integrating a group calling for a right to citizenship in the GDR, Staatsbürgerschaftsrecht der DDR. They are basically pressing for the right to immigrate. Many of these people want to immigrate to West Germany, and they organize, once again, around the human rights principles of the CSC Final Act. And they say, okay, we support human rights too. Let us into your Initiative Frieden und Menschenrechte. And basically the people involved in it say, well, yeah, we support you. And okay, in some cases we'll push. Of course, we agree with this right to immigrate, but we're not going to focus on it, and we don't really want to focus on it in our group. So this is something that sort of remains a constant to the end. And one could also make the argument, we'll see if Henrik gets into this, one could make the argument that it was actually this movement to immigrate that leads to the collapse of the Berlin Wall, more so than the East German dissidents, which is, but still, I would say in this period of 1986 to 89, also thanks to Glasnost and the Soviet Union, there's also increasing contacts between opposition figures in the Soviet Union and East Germany. But the most important contacts actually for the East German opposition are with Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia. So here's my conclusion. Basically, one of the main differences or conflicts with Soviet dissidents is that, in general, the East German opposition did not believe in organizing directly around human rights and CSCE, at least not before 1986. And even after 1986, it wasn't a principal concern of theirs. It wasn't their main focus. And secondly, the East German opposition downplayed the right to immigrate as a human right and even opposed its use by East Germans. They basically said, people need to stay here, they need to oppose this dictatorship, and they need to push for human rights at home. And we can also see this after 1989 or in 1989, many of the East German dissidents want to, in a sense, maintain the division of Germany to establish socialism with a human face, a democratic communism inside of East Germany, and aren't as supportive of German unification, whereas the masses who wanted to migrate to West Germany, they also support German unification. So thank you for your attention, and thank you for inviting me to speak today.
Thank you very much, Doug. Maybe we can take a question from the audience now before moving on to the third speaker. So if there's a question in the audience, please raise your hand. I don't see any questions, so also for the sake of time, I think we'll directly move on to the third speaker. I do have a question for Doug, but I think I'll save it then for the concluding debate, where we will be able to address all three speakers. So again, thank you, Doug. The time is now has now come for our third presentation by Dr. Henrik Bisping. And Henrik will speak about East German dissidents and their role in the peaceful revolution of 1989 and the end of the GDR.
Yes. Hello, and thank you very much for the invitation to all the organizers of this debate and the organizers of the Nowall Europe project. I'll have a little presentation as well. And I need to share my screen. Okay, I think it's working. Yes, the topic is East German dissidents and their role in the peaceful revolution and the end of the GDR. Now I can't. Yeah, this is an overview of the structure, and but I'd like to begin with a look back 30 years after, because in the summer of 2019, just a few weeks before the 30th anniversary of the fall of the wall, a controversy broke out in Germany that dealt with the very topic that I'm discussing today. The sociologist Detlef Pollack published an article in a leading daily newspaper about the revolution under the heading, "It was an uprising of ordinary citizens." He argued that the GDR opposition played a negligible role in the peaceful revolution, and that the demonstrations that began in September of 1989 were in fact largely carried by ordinary GDR citizens. And they, in turn, were not so much motivated by appeals from opposition members, but rather by the mass exodus of East Germans via Hungary from mid-September onwards. The article sharp negative reactions, led by the historian Ilke Sasha Kowalczuk. Kowalczuk argued that it was in fact the oppositional groups who gave the major impetus for the demonstrations that took place in the fall of 1989. And even if tens of thousands of people had taken part in the demonstrations, for instance in Leipzig, this still constituted a minority of the GDR people, while most, as he put it, had waited behind the curtain. And this, argued Kowalczuk, was nothing extraordinary, as revolutions had always been carried out by minorities during the course of history. Next to historians and other scholars, many former GDR civil rights activists took part in the debate. They felt that their contribution to the peaceful revolution was taken away from them. And as is often the case in debates on contemporary history, it was not so much a scholarly discussion, but a battle for sovereignty in interpretation. Who does the peaceful revolution belong to? So, what was the role of the GDR opposition in the peaceful revolution? I would like to address this question in 2 steps before coming to a conclusion. First, the origin of opposition groups and their role in the events that led up to the revolution until October 1989. And second, the dissidents' reactions to the fall of the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November 1989 and their role in the democratization process in the months that followed. First, GDR dissidents and the opposition up to September 1989. The opposition in the GDR was comparatively small. Most oppositional groups that were active in the year leading up to the revolution emerged from the late 1970s onward, as Douglas has pointed out. They dedicated themselves mainly to peace and disarmament, to environmental issues and human rights. Many of these groups were closely connected to the Protestant Church because it was the Church who provided a certain measure of protection against state intervention. Up to 1989, the opposition had not been able to attain broad popular appeal among the East German people. Also, the various groups were only loosely linked. Their visibility was heightened, however, in the course of the year 1989. In May 1999, various opposition groups called for a boycott of the nationwide local elections after they were refused from nominating their own lists of candidates. Then they checked the election results and discovered significant discrepancies from those that were officially announced. And this was one of the first times that the opposition took coordinated GDR-wide action. And also, this action led to a monthly gathering of a small group of protesters on the Alexanderplatz in the center of Berlin. Another place of growing visibility of the opposition was Leipzig. There, prayers for peace were held every Monday night in the Nikolai Church in the center of the city. This tradition had started as early as 1982, and from 1988 onwards, sometimes small demonstrations took place afterwards. On the 4th of September 1989, the prayer services resumed after the summer break. And after the event, roughly 1,000 participants gathered in front of the church, among them dissidents, as well as those who wanted to leave the GDR. Posters were shown which called for an, quote, open country with free citizens. Though these posters were quickly torn down by members of the state security, a small set of prospective immigrants managed to march towards the Leipzig Central Station without being disturbed by the police. And this was the beginning of the so-called Monday demonstrations. During the summer of 1989, several efforts had been undertaken to reorganize the opposition and to expand their base. Most of these initiatives, including Markus Meckel's and Martin Gutzeit's appeal for the formation of a social democratic party in the GDR, most of these initiatives were met with skepticism or indifference. But on the 9th of September, a group of 30 dissidents came together near Berlin and published a manifesto called Awakening 1989, Neues Forum, New Forum. The goal was to establish a platform for a democratic dialogue about the state of the GDR and of the GDR society. It did not comprise a specific political program. The declaration slowly but steadily gained popularity. Within 10 days, 1,500 people had signed it. By the end of September, the number rose to 5,000, and by mid-November to 200,000. The popularity of the initiative was certainly helped by the fact that its publication coincided with the opening of the Austrian-Hungarian border, which led to a mass exodus of GDR citizens to the west. And the growing numbers of refugees and immigrants had been explicitly addressed in the declaration as a sign of disturbed communication between the government and the people. Meanwhile, the number of the participants of the Monday demonstrations in Leipzig rose from week to week. On the 18th of September, an estimated 3,000 people gathered. On the 25th, there were 8,000, and on the 2nd of October, 10,000. The following Monday was highly anticipated because the weekend before, on the 7th of October, the 40th anniversary of the GDR, security forces had brutally cracked down demonstrations in Ostberlin and Dresden. The question was now if there was to be a violent escalation in Leipzig as well. A call for non-violence from both opposition leaders and local SED functionaries and the absence of an order to go into action from Berlin effectuated a peaceful outcome. On the 9th of October, 70,000 people marched on the demonstration, and it marked a turning point in the peaceful revolution. It was the first time the SED surrendered to the power of the street. Plus, it marked a point at which the opposition and a growing number of discontent ordinary citizens worked together successfully. From now on, demonstrations continued to grow in numbers, and the people could take part without fear of police violence. The high point of this development was the demonstration on the 4th of November, when hundreds of thousands of protesters gathered on the Alexanderplatz in Berlin. This was also the first demonstration that was officially registered, but not organized by the party or the mass organizations. Second, the opposition and the fall of the Berlin Wall. The unexpected fall of the Berlin Wall on the evening of the 9th of November was met with widespread enthusiasm and euphoria, both among West Germans and East Germans. The attitude of some of the dissidents was, however, ambivalent. Bärbel Bohley, co-founder of the Neues Forum and probably the best-known protagonist of the opposition at that time, she famously stated, quote, "The people are crazy and the government has lost its mind." The dissidents feared that the events of the 9th of November would endanger the process of the revolution. Would people still go to the streets to call for reforms when they could travel or even move to the West? Some dissidents felt virtually politically depossessed, and their hopes of creating a reformed GDR by means of a third way, somewhere between socialism and capitalism, these hopes were being crushed. Some even discussed if the opposition shouldn't call for a reclosing of the border because they feared an economic sellout of the GDR. The gap between the members of the opposition and the GDR population widened in the weeks after the fall of the wall. The people did not feel properly represented by the opposition anymore. And the dissidents, for their part, had a tendency to disregard the practical needs of the ordinary people and their desire to be a part of the West German consumer society. In retrospect, some of the civil rights activists, for instance, Ulrike Poppe, who was mentioned before, they have conceded that their attitude to the GDR people in that period bordered on arrogance. The focal point of many GDR citizens had shifted in the course of November and December of 1989. The people no longer put their hopes in the opposition, but in the West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who had pressed ahead with suggestions for a path to German unity in late November. The critical attitude of prominent members of the Neue Forum towards the fall of the wall and the exodus led to mass resignation from the platform. In other opposition groups, such as the Demokratischer Aufbruch, Democratic Renewal, the dissent regarding the question of reunification led to a split. On the other side, after the 9th of November, the structure of the participants of the Monday demonstrations changed. Fewer dissidents and more ordinary people took part, and they increasingly called for unification. Germany, United Fatherland became a popular slogan. But even though the lack of influence of the civil rights movement and the opposition on the future development of the GDR became obvious by the end of 1989, this doesn't mean they did not play an important role in the ongoing transformation process. The dissidents were the backbone of the citizens' committees who monitored the dissolution of the State Security Service. They helped establish and took part in the so-called Round Table, an instrument to control and advise the current government led by SED politician Hans Modrow. They also played a crucial role in the preparation of the first free parliamentary election in the GDR, the Volkskammerwahl, on 18th of March, 1990. And against this background, the complete marginalization of civil rights groups in this election is not without irony. All of them together gained hardly more than 6% of the vote. Consequently, the dissidents did not play a major part in the government that was established afterwards. Only two of its members, Defense Minister Rainer Eppelmann and Foreign Affairs Minister Markus Meckel, had been active in the opposition before the summer of 1989. Now, conclusion. The opposition in the GDR was small and relatively weak. The mass exodus to the West in the 1950s and the growing number of immigrants in the 1980s limited the potential for resistance within the state. The famous process of exodus and voice as put forward by Albert Hirschman. Second, the majority of the dissidents called for reforms within the existing system, better communication, human rights, personal freedom, etc. They did not want to overcome socialism. So when the power vacuum in the GDR grew in the course of the autumn of 1989, the opposition was not prepared to take over. Third, the oppositional groups lacked a strong rooting in the GDR population. Before 1989, their actions went by widely unnoticed by the majority of the people. And after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the opposition's ideas, conceptions, and visions for the future of the GDR increasingly diverged from those of the ordinary people. Fourth, the political, social, and economical development of the GDR from November 1989 onwards was less and less determined by domestic actions. Rather, it was determined by external factors: the policy of the West German government, the international negotiations on the German reunification, and most important of all, the open border to the West and the continuing drain of people to the Federal Republic. Still, I would argue the opposition played a small but a crucial role for the revolution in its decisive phase between the beginning of September and the beginning of October 1989. Firstly, it shows the population that there were people who were striving for an alternative to leaving the GDR. Secondly, and more importantly, the opposition provided the crystallization point for the mass protests that began in the autumn of 1989. The monthly protest gatherings against the falsification of the GDR local election on Berlin Alexanderplatz, and the prayers for peace who took place every Monday night in Leipzig's Nikolai Church. These worked as starting points without whom mass demonstrations would likely not have been able to develop. So going back to the controversy between Kowalczuk and Pollack that I mentioned in the beginning, it is not a question of yes or no when it comes to the role of the GDR dissidents in the peaceful revolution. Much more, it is a question of how one weighs different factors. And as a radio debate between these two scholars from September 2019 has proved, there's much common ground between the two major counterparties of the controversy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Henrik, for your very interesting talk. We have almost 30 more minutes to go, so I do invite the audience now to address one or several of the speakers with their questions. Please, everyone. I don't see any questions or anyone raising hands here. Maybe a few more minutes to formulate ideas or reactions. I do have a few questions to the presenters, and I'd like to start with Norman. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit about the notion of hagiography of the dissidents as problematic? Why do you think that is, and also who is to blame, so to say, historians, journalists, politicians, or maybe even the dissidents or activists themselves?
I'm muted. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so it's a good question, and I think that who's responsible? Let's start there for the hagiography. I think it's all of the above. Although I would think it's more the West, those of us in the West, who looked at dissidents, especially in the Soviet Union, but also in Central Europe. In the case of East Germany is a little bit different, but maybe I'll talk about that, separately. But especially in the Soviet Union, these were, freedom fighters, underground fighters. These were great noble people. We have to be careful about that in every sense. Some of them, a person like Sakharov, who actually was here at Stanford and I never found any chink in his armor, but he was a very humble man, and again, this business, I'm a physicist, I'm not a dissident, is how he thought of who he was, just an honest guy. And we did tend to put a halo, around his head and around that of Solzhenitsyn. Now, Solzhenitsyn's a good example, because he ended up, having a lot of points of view that really are pretty problematic. Not to mention a bit some anti-Semitism, some Russian nationalism and this sort of thing. We're doing the same thing, by the way, with Navalny right now, who himself has, his origins are in the nationalist movement. And, I'm very, I admire what he's doing, and he's obviously a brave man to do it, but let's not create this, this halo around him. Journalists are probably even worse, and that's their job, right? Is to create demons and angels, as a way to kind of make a black and white story for their readers that will attract them. But all of these people had their flaws. And all of them were problematic, in one level or another had issues, and they would admit that themselves. That's why they didn't like this category very much, because it was elevating them into a plane that they didn't want to be in. The dissidents themselves, I find actually, reading their stuff, most of them quite modest. Modest about themselves. They're not modest sometimes about their views. Sometimes they're extremely anti-Western. Even, after having left and come to the West, they were disappointed by what they found. That's almost inevitable. The East Germans who came to West Germany were just, devastated in some ways, even by West German society, although most of them appreciated, I think, not having the Stasi on their back. Still, that hagiography, continues to this day. Again, the people who are working on dissidents, scholars, I think, have done a pretty good job of keeping that to a minimum, and not, kind of creating a group of people who are somehow more larger than life, because they were lifetime figures. And then, you get this whole issue of, who was a Mitarbeiter, with the Stasi among the East German dissidents and that sort of thing. I personally don't think that that's, and you get it in the Soviet Union, you get a lot of it in Poland these days. A lot of revelations about Wałęsa and, his having been in contact with the Polish security services. We know that there was an awful lot of that going on, but I don't think, on the other side of the coin, it diminishes, their important role. And I think, by the way, in the end, that Henrik has it right. You just have to, it's partly the population of East Germany, partly the role of the opposition figures. There's no black and white kind of argument. I don't actually like that argument the way at least Henrik portrayed it, but I think he's right. What the solution to the argument is that dissidents played an important role, and some of them were not the most admirable people, and populations are also important. And in East Germany, Soviet Union too, popular views were important.
Thank you. I'll open the floor for questions from the audience as soon as I see any reaction. Otherwise, I'll just go on asking my own questions. To Doug, and you know this from the ongoing debate between historians, Doug. There are those historians of the Soviet Union who think that historians of the CSE and the dissidents and human rights overestimate actually the importance of soft power and all of this altogether, and who believe that the fall of the wall and the end of the Cold War more generally simply is a hard power issue and related to the crumbling hard power of the Soviet Union. What do you think about that position and the discussion that's still going on?
This puts me in sort of a bad situation because I'm probably one of those people who would make that argument. I think it was actually one of the reasons why, Norman mentioned this, in the 1970s and 1980s, there aren't mass arrests, there aren't mass executions, and the question is why? And it's partly due to the détente policy, but why does the Soviet Union want détente? It's because they need economic relations with the West. They need Western technology. They need Western loans. They can't afford to prop up their satellite states anymore. So let's say Poland is the most extreme example, basically bankrupting itself with Western loans. The GDR acts like that they're holier than thou. Look at those stupid Poles and what they're doing. And they even use some of their sort of nationalistic very anti-Polish sort of sentiment even in the Politburo in East Germany, but they're also very dependent on loans from West Germany. So I would say that if you're looking at the long term, certainly you would have to say it's structural factors, including the fact that they can't keep up with Western armament, which is part of the whole economic problem as well. And it's Gorbachev's economic reforms that, also bankrupt the Soviet Union or make the economy there so terrible that, it contributes to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I do think that those factors are important. I think the CSEE process and the dissidents are important, though, in the sense of trying to explain why did it collapse peacefully. There's other options. They could have gone for re-Stalinization, right? Which is why Gorbachev is so important. You have the counterexample of Romania under Ceausescu. He dealt with foreign loans by basically starving his own people and paying them off, right? And suppressing all opposition domestically. Or there's also the possibility that the Soviet Union could have gone out with a bang instead of a whimper, right? And it's very important that you had this ongoing process between East and West. So I think the CSEE process, also what the dissidents did, help explain why communism collapsed peacefully, but they weren't the cause of the collapse themselves, right? Of course, if nobody had gone out in the street and protest, if nobody had said we want to end this regime or we're against this regime, then of course it wouldn't have ever ended, right? So in that sense, and they didn't know what the risks were. They could have, up to the end, Honecker was talking about a Chinese solution, Tiananmen Square type solution. So I don't think it takes anything away from the dissidents to say, well, there are these long-term factors that help explain why they're successful or somewhat successful in the 1970s and 80s, as opposed to being executed like in the 1950s.
Thank you. And I'd like to maybe pose the next question first to Henrik, but maybe also Doug and Norman want to react to that. And that is about the maybe considering also what's going on now with social media and technology available today as a challenge to the Kremlin today. Back then, the role of technology in circulating information, what is the relevance of that in your opinion?
The role of technology.
technology and the ways and means to activists, but also broader public to circulate information. Do you see that as a game changer at a certain point of time in the 1970s and 80s? What do you think about its relevance?
Well, for the GDR, of course, the most important factor was the availability of West German radio and television, because the SED government never could cut off the GDR population from information from Western societies and media, and they, in the end, they actively used this to gain visibility, and they even had their there were two dissidents who secretly filmed parts of the first demonstrations in Leipzig in September and smuggled these videos to a Western TV magazine. They showed it, so this reinforced these demonstrations. Then they didn't have the control. They didn't have the monopoly on news and media, and I think this is a very important factor. There were also former dissidents that emigrated or were forced to leave the country, well, the most famous of them is probably Roland Jahn, who is now in charge of the Federal Agency for the Stasi Files, who worked for West Berlin TV and made reports on dissidents of the GDR. I think this is very important for this whole process, because you need to gain visibility. People need to know that there is something going on to be able to participate.
So let me just add, for the Soviet Union, you don't have that kind of immediate information factor available at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, but I would not underestimate the role of the radios, that's, say, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, also BBC, and even television crews who were in. I mean, as a result of Glasnost and the opening up of the Soviet Union at the end of the 80s, there are television crews there. They're, all the time. Actually, my wife was a translator during that period for one of the television crews, and she, they went all over Moscow, doing interviews, and so there was information, a much broader sense of information than had been there previously. But part of it was to do with Gorbachev himself and having opened up the Soviet Union to that possibility. So, I mean, it's nothing like today. Obviously, today it's just astonishing, of course, how everyone in Russia knows about Navalny, and how there was, how many hits? I think there was, there are millions of hits on that one, video. Actually, it's tens of millions of hits on that one video that, shows this kind of palace, this alleged palace of Putin on the Black Sea. So anyway, the point is that today it's much more widespread, much more important, but it was important then too.
We have Robert here on the list who wants to ask a question. Please, Robert.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to all presenters, especially my old friend Norman. I enjoyed your presentation, and the others with their focus on the GDR and the CSCE process. Excellent presentations. I guess as someone who's worked on the church and the GDR, I'd like to add a few comments in terms of their role. And I think I would agree with Doug's analysis that human rights really wasn't a primary focus in the church either. The East German Lutheran Church was very kind of ambivalent about this dialogue and the whole Helsinki process. It's interesting in terms of pastors that wanted to emigrate to the West, just like, you know, normal GDR citizens, pastors couldn't simply up and leave. And the church in the East discouraged it and actually struck a deal with the West German churches that limited the employment possibilities of pastors that were given exit visas to the West. So I think that reveals their kind of ambivalence about this, the freedom of travel. When the whole debate about human rights developed in the late 70s, of course, international organizations were discussing this as well, but the East German Church was very ambivalent about the debates in the World Council of Churches when, you know, issues of repression of dissent in the Soviet bloc came up in those meetings. The East Germans usually tried to kind of dampen the discussion. And I think the other thing I would say about the church's position is when I was doing my research, they would always encourage me to remember the other side of human rights. We in the West emphasized individual civil liberties, and they said, you're forgetting the social part of human rights. And so there was, to the extent that they grappled with the question of human rights, they tended to tilt in the direction of the social dimension. And I think that sort of fits in with the narrative that to the extent that there was dissent in the GDR, it was kind of system immanent. You know, they kind of assumed that socialism would continue and we have to reform it and improve it. So I guess, you know, those would be, you know, my comments about the human rights. In terms of the inflection point, I think the church remained very important in this period, 87 to 89. So they were ambivalent and really negative about prioritizing freedom of immigration. But when things turned from simply private petitions to the government to leave, but into a kind of open protest movement, then I don't think you can really underestimate the importance of the church in kind of facilitating that. And of course, Leipzig, I suppose, is the best example, but it's not the only example. And you know, some recent scholars have looked at the northern portions of the GDR and seen also similar kind of movements percolating in the church. So this transition from private petitions, which are kind of discouraged or handled with quiet diplomacy by Mr. Stolpe, to public protest, I think, you know, the church was really a crucial actor in that. I guess my question, I sort of want to come back to the differences and similarities and this whole question of, you know, it started with Norman's distinction there, I guess, that in the Soviet Union, they didn't really start from the point of departure, a Marxist point of departure in critiquing the regime, whereas in the GDR, they did. And we haven't talked about Poland, but it's always struck me that the Solidarity movement in some sense was successful to a certain extent because they challenged the regime on its own terms. You're claiming to speak for the workers and you've abandoned the workers. So I guess my question, sort of interpretive in terms of the implications of these two approaches, which is more successful, or what are the implications of dissent from a perspective of sharing the assumptions of the regime and challenging them on that basis versus challenging the regime from a totally different perspective?
Thank you, Robert. Who would like to respond to the question? And then we'll leave the final word to Felix to wrap today's session.
I'm glad to.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. You can't see me, but I can hear me. So it's a really good question, but I think we have to go back to first principles, which is that each of the dissident movements, whether it's Solidarity or whether it's Soviet dissident movement or East German, were also alliances of various movements. So we can't overly characterize them. But I mean, I think it's clear that in the Polish case that you brought up, that Solidarity, even though it appealed to the government on behalf of the sort of rights of workers, it was quite clear, especially to the core part of Solidarity, meaning the intelligentsia leadership of Solidarity, the human rights were at the center of what they were doing, even though they were allied with a sort of working class, kinds of issues that were presented to the government. I tend to think those were, they weren't completely tactical, but they were mostly tactical, much as in the Soviet Union, people were applying to, were appealing to Soviet legality. So these are tactical efforts, to promote human rights, basically. I mean, Michnik said at one point when dealing with the whole peace question, the peace movement question, he says, there can't be peace without individual liberty and rights. So for him, the whole peace issue was secondary, to individual liberty and rights. And I would guess to him also, individual rights were important to many of the working class Solidarity leaders who were, after all, Catholic, right? And very Catholic and believers and wanted to be kind of emancipated as individual believers as well as workers. So I hope, Bob, that answers your question. Yeah.
Thank you very much, all of you, for staying with us for now almost 2 hours. 9 o'clock is Berlin, Central European time is fastly approaching. So I think we'll wrap up here. Thank you very much, Douglas, Henrik, and Norman, for your presentations and the discussion. And I would like to give the final word to Felix.
Thank you very much, Aryo. I would like to thank every of the participants and the speakers and the host also for this event, because one of the main objectives of this event and this project is to raise awareness of what have happened before the fall of the war, and also after, but principally before the fall of the wall. And I think the past events and this one have contributed a lot to this objective. Again, thank you all for having this great evening. And I just want you to say that we will have also another event in 8th of March at the same time. And we will have a dissident, not a dissident, because she didn't leave GDR, but a member of a movement. I can't say the name. Let me just check if I don't spell it wrong. Katrin Attenhauer, I think I spell it right. Okay, she will speak a bit about her experience in the movement, and I can also tell you that the topic is peaceful revolution as a resistance social movement, the unknown citizens and the fall of the wall. I hope you are able to listen and make questions, participate a bit if you want. Thank you very much for your time, and have a nice evening and see you until the 8th of March.